something like that anyway. I'm sure it's going to get muddled up. Thank you very much for inviting me to present today, and I'm privileged to be following excellent program that we've had so far with the wonderful welcome, and then Shauna giving an insight into her life as well, and her experiences through that journey that she had. So my presentation, I decided, was uncovering the vast talents of nurses, and a lot of you will know that I've been involved in history, and I'm also a collector of stuff. And the stuff usually involves stamps, postcards, and anything else that matches that. So what I wanted to do today was follow through on, or to talk about you as nurses, I suppose, through some bits and pieces as we go along. So to start with, I just want to say I was privileged to be in Malta in February with the European Nurse Educators Conference there. And one of the, we had, you know, a minister from the government come and speak at the opening session and then leave. And it was very interesting to see Judith Charmian call it out in relation to that sort of activity going on, because she felt that if you were here, you should be listening to the nurses here. So I was just interested to see whether the same thing would have happened in this forum, and it did, but it didn't in the same place. Now, Judith Charmian, for those who don't know, was the immediate past president of the International Council of Nurses, and so she's not short of a word or two. All right, so now that I've had my say, I'll get on. Okay, so last week, of course, we saw a lot of history repeating itself, isn't it? A bit like the Shirley Bassey song, you know, if make you want to break out into it. And this is what we sort of talk about sometimes in terms of, you know, what we bear witness to, that we actually see history repeating itself. But what else do we actually bear witness to in our diverse practice of nursing that we can learn from and that will take us into the future? Oh, it worked. Okay. So from my perspective, this is what you were going to look like, except you're all now elevated. So it doesn't quite work the same. But however, what I wanted to see here was that this is what I see of you from where I stand. But there you are, a diversity of nurses, and you bring with you vast talents, just as these nurses did. And of course, Shauna has indicated that as well. So the first postcard, obviously, these are two meetings. They just happen to both be in Germany, but two meetings of the International Council of Nurses. One was in 1912, which is the first meeting they had after the death of Florence Nightingale, and they started to work on the living memorial of the Florence Nightingale International Foundation. And then the other one is in 1965, also in Germany. And this was, the result of this was a second edition of the International Council of Nurses Code of Ethics, which had been originally published in 1953 after World War II. So what is history? History is, good history challenges our assumptions, really, doesn't it? And it's it's about our contemporary selves by seeing ourselves in, I didn't write this down, you see, so that's why I'm having to read it there. And practice is more complex and multiple story. But some of the stories obviously are noble and inspiring, but there are also some very challenging aspects to our nursing history as well. So we do need to remember that we do have skeletons in the cupboard through the evolution of our nursing profession. Yesterday was the third Australian College of Nursing, History of Nursing Conference, and the diversity and the mix of the research and the stories was fantastic. And it just goes to show the diversity that we do come from and how different we perceive our history as well. These pictures are just some of the representations of what each person brought to us and the gems that they gave to us in terms of being able to ply our trade in the health system, which is often complex and overbearing. Well, it is complex, but also often overbearing. So just a little bit of an explanation. Probably the only one that was totally represented there was the Royal Flying Doctor Service, which has its 90th anniversary this year. But we have the Australian Inland Mission, Parramatta Female Factory is in relation to midwives. Lucy Osborne was mentioned. And then, of course, there was a paper in relation to the third Australian General Hospital on Lemnos, which is, Grace Wilson was the matron of that. This is me. Okay, now here I am at Auckland Public Hospital, July 14, 1969. I just wanted to, yes, 50 years. I think Ronnie, I had that thing was over 40 years. Well, yes, it will be 50 years next year, just like the moon landing. It's going to be 50 years next year. And also, it's one of those things, you know, people ask you, where were you when the moon landing occurred? And I was on the women's surgical ward, my first ward out of the introductory block. And thank goodness for transistor radios, because we could listen to the broadcast. But unlike the literature, which often tells me when I enlisted in the nursing profession, because I wanted to make a big difference in people's lives, not so. I had agreed to give it a go. It was not my career. It was not a career on my what do you want to be when you grow up agenda. While more opportunities were opening up for girls, there was the traditional female roles that still dominated. The usual teaching, nursing, and health duties together with child rearing, or a mix. This group was nearly 3 times the one that I'm in, and it was only one group for the year, but was nearly 3 times the size of the entire staff of nurses 70 years before in 1899. And it was still, it was still a time, as Laurie Grealish described yesterday at the history conference, as the time of the good nurse, something I'll come back to a little bit later. But now on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be much diversity here, does it? And I think Shauna alluded to this too when she said, you know, you often think about people the way they look and so on. And so when you look at this, a whole bunch of white uniforms sitting there in 4 rows, tiered, here we are, just one large amorphous group. We are the nurses. And what is missing, which would be so obvious as being different in this time, what do you think is actually missing? The men. There were men actually involved, did exist, and there were a few, but they were not in this particular group, and they were very hard to find. And in fact, the men didn't actually get the same badges as the nurses when I was when I graduated. However, I thought this was kind of cute. This was 1952 in Detroit. The graduation had just occurred, and this was apparently a part of a integrating GIs who had left the military back into civilian world, and this gentleman had undertaken a nursing program. So there you go, amongst the bevy of pretty nurses. Okay. Here's some high-fidelity simulation for those of you who are into this, okay? And some of you will know Mrs. Bedford Fenwick. I'll show you her in a minute. Mrs. Bedford Fenwick was, this looks more like Mr. Bedford Fenwick. I can't remember if he had a name. But anyway, so pretty much not what we do today, is it? Also having an anniversary next year, though, is the International Council of Nurses. And so this is why I've included them in my presentation. So we have Mrs. Ethel Bedford Fenwick, and she was named that because she married Dr. Bedford Fenwick. But she was Miss Mason, and she was the matron of St. Bartholomew's Hospital before she married. The anniversary that I'm going to talk about here is that it's 120 years since the first meeting was held to establish the International Council of Nurses. And this was held in London in July. And it was a time when steps were taken to organise the council and nursing on a global scale. There had already been discussion in 1893 around the possibility of doing this, because at this time there was a large investment in nursing programs, and particularly in America at that time as well. Some very well known ones came into being. So these are just some of the members of the council. It has a large number of members now. It started with just a few, but it has a large number. So just giving you some idea, the one in the top left corner on your viewing it is Miss Hellemans from the Belgian Nurses Association, and she was on her way to Montreal to the ICN Congress in 1929. And she's in her Nurses Association uniform, but you probably can't see it, but she's actually got on the tie, it's not very clear, it's a little badge, which was actually the little logo of the International Council of Nurses at that point. We also have a membership of nurses from Iran, and they have a slightly different story. Well, they have a different story about their history as well. And then, obviously, there's membership from the Australia. That aerogram is from 1961, and it was sent to Canada by a delegate with an interesting letter about how many people were there and so on. But history is not just about anniversaries. The vast talents of nurses have been found in places familiar to today. And so today, of course, is, well, at the moment, of course, we have had lots and concerned about and raising money for to support those in trouble with the drought that we're experiencing. In 1903, there was another terrible drought, and this time it was, there was a outbreak of typhoid in Coonamble, which is in northwest New South Wales. Does anyone come from Coonamble? Near there, yeah. Okay, I've not been to Coonamble. It's sort of somewhere between Walgett and Coonabarabran, or, yeah. Oh, hello. You would know. But anyway, in 1903, in the early months there, they'd been experiencing a very severe drought, and Coonamble, unfortunately, had a typhoid problem through that period. There was little bits and pieces around in Tamworth and so on as well. But what I wanted to talk to you about here was that this was an article written by a nurse who was actually there. You can see she writes under a nom de plume, Araluen. Araluen is actually a little place near where I live, down in Canberra. And the hospital was unable to cope with the number of patients. So the stock cell yards were set up to take patients. The buildings of the stockyards and tents were used and 20 additional nurses were shipped in over that time. Some community members were nursed in their homes by the Sisters of St. Joseph's. So Araluen was the nom de plume of nurse Agnes Macready, and Agnes has been described as the first woman war correspondent. And this article that she wrote actually reflects journalistic style, obviously, as well. She was a trained nurse, having done her course or undertaken her course at the Royal Prince Alfred in Sydney, which wasn't royal then, but it is now. She was the first Australian nurse to travel to South Africa after the Second Anglo-Boer War was declared in 1899, arriving even before the first contingent of Australian troops. So you will see in her comparison, she states, first of all, they're just a South African experience all over again. And she goes on to say, the air of romance associated with active service in South Africa is entirely wanting in Coonamble. The world outside cares nothing for Coonamble, and Coonamble has lost sight of the world. Its social barometer rises or falls according to the number of fresh cases reported daily and the one desire of the healthy to get down country away from the plague that has broken out. In South Africa, in extemporised hospitals, we were ministering angels, she's put in inverted commas, attending to those wants of heroes over whose heads floated visions of the Victoria Cross. In Coonamble, we are just nurses, waiting on ordinary men and women folk, fully convinced that the cows which accompanied us in the train are quite as important as ourselves. A nurse might be replaced in Coonamble, but not a cow. For we contend with, in many instances, exactly the same difficulties. Patients roll in and beds must be made up somehow. Patients sponged and somebody has recommandeered the valuable tin dish, the finding of which in a neighbour's sheep pen entails loss of time and temper. So she goes on. And so they were, sleeping in the horse floats and so on as well. So history's not just about heroes, anniversaries, or this one here is literally bearing witness, I suppose, in that respect. Now, just moving into now a little bit more about the nursing of the concept of heroes. What I wanted to mention here was that history is full of nursing heroes who have made a difference. So, and we know this from the key people that we've talked about and looked up to as leaders within the evolution of the profession. And usually we get to hear about specific names that have become familiar. However, there are also the silent ones. This postcard is the story of the first contingent of wounded from Gallipoli arriving back in New Zealand. With the man as the mayor, he's obviously the one with the chain around his neck, and the papers record this and the name of the men across the items. However, the nurses are unnamed. So the nurses are actually Australian nurses in this picture. Recently, a patient who was a well-known former member of Parliament and now political commentator who's been very sick wrote from his hospital bed on one of his visits an article which was titled, "Nurses are the True Heroes of Our Hospital." So this was this year. The article is over 800 words long. The bit about the nurses amounts to 197 words and fits in towards the end after the vivid details about the doctors have been given. This is how the nurses were described. So the title is "The Nurses are the True Heroes of Our Hospital," but condensing it down to a short paragraph, the description goes, in the early 1980s, when the surgeon strike was in full flight, I remember telling Neville Wran and Bob Hawke, you can't run hospitals without doctors. I was only half right. You can't run hospitals without nurses either. They never seem to go on strike, and yet whatever as a society we are paying them is not enough. The kindness and competence of Anthea, Lily, Daisy, Avril, Donna, Sunny, Reese, Albert, Jing, and all the others I don't have space to mention, are the true heroes who never get awards and medals. What's more, they don't seek that kind of recognition. Their reward is alleviating pain and suffering. There is honour surging in every one of them. Now, it's fairly nice to have comments made about the value of the nurses and a very positive valuing of the nurses, but there's no mention, apart from their pain, alleviating pain and suffering, that there is what they're actually doing. And also, one of the things is that the doctors got full descriptions about their, almost their qualifications and so on. The nurses end up in one sentence as a bunch of names. So one of the things that this does for us, of course, is to just perpetuate a lack of understanding about what we actually do and what our talents are. And as well-meaning as it may have been, it's unfortunate that it's a perpetuation of something that exists already. Okay, so here I am again, back at the beginning, and with the bright, fresh-faced potential nurses bringing their talents to the world of nursing to make a difference in patient care. Has anybody picked out where I am? Bottom row, third on the right, on the side. It's me. We've all got what we used to call our Woolworths deli hats on. There's our cardboard. So you could just put them together fairly quickly, and it used to be what you used to see at the supermarket with the people behind the sort of delicatessen counter. Okay, so here is a large group of bright, fresh-faced potential nurses bringing talents to the world of nursing to make a difference to patient care. Are we so amorphous? Are we just the nurses? This kind of looks like it, doesn't it? And it always reminds me of a joke, I have to say, that you tell when you're a child, or maybe you don't anymore. It's a long time since that happened. But it was the kind of joke that went something along the lines of, what did Tarzan say when he saw the elephants coming over the hill with their sunglasses on? Because the answer is nothing, because he didn't recognise them. So in terms of the nurses and this big white amorphous mass, there's not a lot of individuality happening here. But in fact, every one of those people have brought their backgrounds, their culture, and their talents to this profession. Some, unfortunately, didn't last, and some, like me, are still going, who was never going to be a nurse. Now, Gardner, Duffield, Dabrowski, and Adams recently published an article related to evidence and workforce planning. This was the famous one which had identified 66 nursing position titles nationally and which gave rise to 7 clusters that they identified across the nation. In the conclusion, they made an important observation. Now, I did read it all. I didn't go from the abstract to the conclusion. The nursing workforce in Australia, as in other countries, is primarily developed through a process of evolution. That is, positions and titles have been created to address service gaps or new directions in clinical care, or as an outcome of industrial enterprise negotiations. This has been a consequence of lack of knowledge of the service potential and clinical capacity of nurses at various levels and stages in their career development, which is a very important point. And this research provides the knowledge and tools for service planners to now match existing nursing position titles to patient and community needs. So that says to me that we don't really want to be looked at as a bunch of amorphous nurses. We want to be looked at as individuals with talents, with skills that we have developed that we can use effectively to make the difference. So, to finish with then, I just want to make a couple more points in relation to that. So I think one of the things is that there is a historical background to this, and it's important for us to understand the changes and how this can impact on progress and improve it, and how it can inform policy. And we are all different. Each of us brings the talents, as I keep saying, and our learned skills, and to make a difference to the practice we carry out. So, as I said before, we are not an amorphous lot. And on that note, I would like to hand you over to Nurse Mendoza to finish.
My name is Nurse Mendoza, and I'm proud to say I'm a critical care nurse. We don't just assess, plan, implement, and evaluate. And this is not a doctor's stethoscope. This is a nurse's stethoscope. And we use this to auscultate, listen to GI sounds, cardiac sounds, and pulmonary sounds. And remember, we're also the first line of defense. We're there to be proactive and delegate, and also dang sure we are educated. So remember, when we're malnourished and also maybe full bladder and lethargic and weak, we're there to save lives, because nursing is my talent.
Thank you.